A Test of Honor. A short story. Waiting outside the doors of the exam room, Fuska rushed through her notes. She had studied for the past moon, but it never hurt to cram. A hard, wooden bench with no back was not the ideal spot to study, but Fuska would take every advantage she could get. She had passed 6 entrance exams. One more would grant her entry into the Tower of Animo, where the greatest minds learned from the secrets of the gods. On the bench on the opposite side of the room, the only other student waited, his eyes shut, his mouth silent. Was the young man as prepared as Fuska? Was he as nervous? With a great creak, an attendant opened the doors to the exam hall. Fuska entered as she had done 6 times before. The other examinee followed behind her, then the attendant shut the doors. "Take your seats." The professor didn't bother to look up from his desk as he spoke. He never did. Not in the 6 times Fuska had written in this very hall. There was no reason to think the 7th would be different. On her first exam, this room had been crammed with hundreds of students, each hopeful to gain admission to the Animo. That was an aptitude test. Its questions are random and designed to test for the raw reasoning power of one's mind, in a way that cannot be studied for. Fuska took her seat. The boy sat in front of her. They faced each other. Fuska recognized the boy from the last exam. 7 examinees sat for that one. She couldn't imagine being one of those 5 people that had passed 5 exams, only to be sent home after the 6th. Each subsequent exam, only a fraction of students remained from the last. There must have been around 36 students in the 4th exam. Focus, Fuska. The only contents on her desk were a pencil and a sheet of paper, flipped over so its contents could not be seen. She stared at the boy, his eyelids shut and his hands folded on his desk. An unusual one, but the Tower of Animo was no place for common folk. "The exam is ethics." The professor looked at the students. "From commencement, you have 1 hour to complete the exam, at which point pencils must be down. You may begin now." The boy opened his eyes and flipped his paper and snatched his pencil. Fuska woke from her daze. Glancing at other students' papers was not permitted while writing the exam. She didn't want to give the impression she was cheating. The professor buried his eyes back into his thick tome, oblivious to the world around him. Fuska glanced through the questions to get an estimate of how long it should take. It was best to plan how long you were going to spend on each section so you didn't run out of time at the end. There were only 3 questions. The first question.
What digs but has no hole, eats soup but has no bowl, and is round but cannot roll?
A riddle, and one Fuska had never heard before. Was this to relax the students or throw them off? This was supposed to be an ethics exam. Focus. Fuska was staring straight ahead, lost in thought. The other student's pencil was writing furiously and scratching out those words with almost as much vigor. Fuska snapped her eyes away. Glancing at the other student's papers was not permitted while writing the exam. She didn't want to give the impression she was cheating. The professor's eyes were buried in his thick tome, oblivious to the world around him. Next question. She could come back to the first one.
Draw a closed loop, like a circle, but it can be any shape, as long as it's only one continuous line. Then draw a perfect square inside this loop so that all four corners of the square are touching the loop.
If Fuska had thought for 1,000 years, this was not a question she could have predicted. Oh well, it seemed simple enough. Fuska's pencil free-flowed around the paper. Her single line formed a blob. She traced a square around the inside, but it wasn't quite right. One side was a little long and the corners were not quite 90 degrees. She drew another square, but the same thing happened. Again and again. She couldn't make a single square that fit inside her blob and touched all lines. She clenched her fist in frustration and fired a huff of frustration out of her mouth and nose. Fuska was staring straight ahead, furious. The other student's pencil was scratching and erasing at a lightning speed. Fuska snapped her eyes away. Glancing at other students' papers was not permitted while writing the exam. She didn't want to give the impression that she was cheating. The professor's eyes were buried in his thick tome, oblivious to the world around him. Next question. She could come back to the first two. Only one question remained.
In what year will the first man return the sacred sword to Codin-no-Fiwood, the tree of life?
Fuska's eyes went wide. She had read the holy book, The Light and Darkness, dozens of times. Its sacred script was clear. No man could know the day, or year, or time that the first man returned the sacred sword to Codin-no-Fiwood. The very framing of the question was ludicrous, bordering on blasphemy. Fuska threw up her arms in frustration. Fuska was staring straight ahead, incredulous. The other student's pencil worked at speed and volume high enough to transcribe an entire holy book. Glancing at the other student's paper was not permitted while writing the exam. She didn't want to give the impression she was cheating. The professor's eyes were shut. The thick tome was too much for the old man. How did the other student answer with such confidence? Fuska couldn't help herself from looking. His answers were no better than hers. For the riddle he wrote mushroom. That wasn't the answer. Not that hers was any better. His blob and square were incomplete as well. For his final answer, he just wrote as much scripture as he could fit on the remainder of his paper. It couldn't hurt to use the same ideas. Just a little. Fuska wrote. Her letters were small, yet speedy. She wrote underneath her riddle answer and around her blob. She wrote and wrote and wrote. Just as she filled the last white of her paper, the professor spoke. Pencils down. Please bring your papers forward and exit via the door behind me. Fuska went numb. She had just finished the 7th and final test for the entry of the Tower of Animo. It was nothing like the ethics test she had studied. She had no idea if she passed. Her entire future was riding on this paper. The other student handed in his test. Would you like to know how you did? The professor asked. The other student was shocked, but nodded. The professor held up the student's paper. It was too far away for Fuska to see. The other student pumped his fist, then half danced, half ran out of the room. Fuska had seen his answers. If he had passed, she had likely passed as well. She handed her paper to the professor. He studied it, then spoke. Would you like to know how you did? Fuska nodded. Then the professor held up the paper to her. All her answers and scratchings were there. At first she didn't know what she was looking at. Then her pencil lines began to move. The lines circled until they came together as a swirl. They swirled for a few seconds, then stopped. All her writing had transformed into a sketch of the other student writing his exam. The remaining lines swirled around the other student's image. Then the lines stopped swirling until they formed a perfect image. Eyes. Fuska's eyes. Just above the other student's paper. With her mouth agape, Fuska stood, stunned in silence. "You have failed your ethics exam and are denied admission to study at the Tower of Animo."